Welcome everyone to Journeys through the Books of the Prophets. Before we get to our learning, I want to take this opportunity. Most of you, I assume, get our emails, get our WhatsApps, and hopefully everyone knows that right now we're almost at the end of our once-a-year fundraising appeal. First, I want to thank, here I'm speaking to not just the people who are live tonight, but all the people who will be watching it this week, that we only do this once a year. And many people watching or who will be watching have already given and given generously. But to be honest, we could use more support. All of these classes are free. Most of what we do is for free, and we need the public support to continue what Or Chadash is doing. So if you have benefited from Or Chadash in the past or in the present, we ask everyone to remember us and to help us continue the very, very important educational work that we are doing. And again, I want to thank those people who have been very, very generous that allow us to do what we do. But we are dependent on public support, and we hope you will open your hearts and your pockets and just go to our website, thetrugmans.com, and you can donate online, or if you have a different way that you would like to contribute, write to our email, rabbi@thetrugmans.com. We are picking up on the book of Melachim in chapter 19. Where we left off was one of the most famous stories in the books of the prophets, where Eliyahu Navi does what we call the contest of the gods at Carmel, and he proves to the people who the true God is. It was Eliyahu against 450 priests of Baal, and only he could bring fire down from heaven. And then that went along with the end of a 3-year drought that Eliyahu had said, no rain will fall other than by my word. And when the three years passed, and finally God told Eliyahu, it's time for the rain. So that's how we ended chapter 18. It did begin to rain. And in fact, God told him to run before the carriage, the chariot of Achav, the king, the very evil king of the northern kingdom. And Eliyahu got superhuman strength. All of this is a review. And he ran in front of the chariot of Achav until they got down to the plains and avoided the flooding, which is interesting because right now in Israel there's been major flooding, and supposedly we have one more day of a major storm. We're in the 3rd or 4th day of the storm, and they're predicting a lot more rain and unfortunately a lot more flooding. So now we pick up in chapter 19 with also one of the most well-known stories. So what happens is Achav returns home to the palace, and he reveals to his wife, Jezebel, that in this contest of the gods afterwards, especially because of Jezebel, remember, Achav and Jezebel were among the worst kings and queens in Jewish history. And they had killed almost all of the prophets. The only real prophet that was not being hidden was Eliyahu Navi. And because they used the priest of Baal to kill the Jewish prophets, Eliyahu turned on the prophets of Baal and he had them all killed. So when the news got back to Jezebel, so she sent a message to Eliyahu Navi saying, by this time tomorrow, you will also be dead. You're finished. So Eliyahu escapes and he goes south. And he comes to Beersheba. And what we're going to see here is there are a number of comparisons between Eliyahu Navi and Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not explicit, but we'll see a number of deep connections between Eliyahu Navi and Moshe Rabbeinu. So Eliyahu comes to Beersheba, and he had he's called a servant, but he probably was one of the helpers of the prophets. And he said, "You stay here," because he felt it was very dangerous. He was being hunted at this point. And when he came to Beersheba, now he's on his own, and he sat down and he called out to God, "Take my life. I'm at the end here. I'm at the end here. I'm the last known prophet." If you remember, the Obadiah was hiding 100 prophets. They were the last prophets left. We have to understand that in this age, there were schools of prophecy. And Eliyahu was the prophet, but there were, we'll call it schools of prophecy, where people learned different, we'll call it meditative techniques in order to reach higher consciousness, where one could possibly be a fitting vessel for prophecy. It's not something you got a diploma for, and it wasn't that you were guaranteed to be a prophet. That wasn't the point. It was to teach, we'll call it advanced meditative techniques, how to purify oneself. And people did it because they wanted to be close to God. So Obadiah was hiding 100 prophets. He risked his life and his wife also, and they fed them. But the only revealed prophet left was Eliyahu. And at this point, he feels he's at the end. And he says to God, "Take my life. I'm finished." So here's the first connection with Moshe Rabbeinu. This is a story that it's in the text. It's not a midrash. It's in the book of Bamidbar. And at one point, Moshe Rabbeinu is he's kind of fed up, and he also requests from God, "Take my life. I can't deal with this on my own anymore. I just can't." And that's when God said, "Choose 70 elders, and you will take from your ruach, your spirit, and you will put it on these 70 elders." And that is what happened. That's the beginning of the formation of what we call the Sanhedrin, the high court. But it's very startling that Moshe, he was a human being with all of his greatness. There was never a prophet like Moshe, not before and not after. But he himself was a human being, and he had felt that he reached the end. So what happens here to Eliyahu is that an angel came to him. After he requested that God just take my life, he lay down, and an angel came and touched him and said, Eliyahu, eat something. Now, Eliyahu didn't leave with provisions. So he looks, and there he sees there's a baked cake that was on coals. Well, he didn't make the fire. So obviously this was a miraculous event here, that the angel arranged for him to be fed, and there was a bottle of water for him, and he told him, eat. So Eliyahu eats, and he falls back to sleep. The angel comes again and touches him and says, eat again, because you're going to need the strength for the journey ahead. And then the text says, you'll need this strength for a 40-day and 40-night journey. Now, obviously, that should remind us of the 40 days and 40 nights that Moshe spent at Har Sinai. And where is Eliyahu going to? He's escaping to the Sinai. So he eats this second meal, and by himself, he goes down to the Sinai Peninsula. A question is asked by the commentaries. From Beersheba to the Sinai is not a 40-day journey. Even by foot, it's, I don't know exactly, but 5, 6, 7 days, and you're in the Sinai. So what was meant is that from the beginning of his journey to the end, so after he leaves Mount Sinai, we'll learn about it, until he reached all the way to Damascus, that was 40 days and 40 nights. So the implication is that Eliyahu didn't eat after that meal for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, who else did not eat for 40 days and 40 nights? Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was on Har Sinai. So we see these comparisons. And not only that, it says that he reached the Sinai and he came to a cave. And according to tradition, this is the very cave that Moshe Rabbeinu was hidden in when God revealed the 13 Midot HaRachamim, the 13 principles of compassion. So here we see another connection to Moshe Rabbeinu. So all of these are just very, very deep connections. We're not saying he was a reincarnation of Moshe, but just here in this part of the story, his life is paralleling Moshe's. And of course, in Eliyahu's generation, there was no prophet like Eliyahu. Moshe, there was no prophet like him ever, even Eliyahu Navi. So he comes to the Sinai, he comes to this cave, and God says to him, what are you doing here, Eliyahu? He opens a conversation with Eliyahu. What are you doing here? Because we don't see that God commanded him to go down to the Sinai. So he says, what are you doing here? And Eliyahu says, I am running away because they have killed all of the prophets, and this is very significant, and the people have broken their covenant with you. They have broken down your altars, they've broken the covenant with you, and I'm like the last one standing. So God says, go outside of the cave and stand on the mountain before God. So this was Mount Sinai. And so what happens here is first a tremendous wind comes by. And when I mean tremendous, I mean tremendous. And so Eliyahu assumed that God was in the wind. But the text says, but God was not in the wind. And then there was, we'll call it an earthquake. The earth shook. And again, Eliyahu, it's obvious that these are beyond nature events happening. So he assumed that God would present himself, not in the earthquake, but subsequent to the earthquake. But the text says, but God was not in the earthquake. And then there was a great fire, whether it was a physical fire or a vision of fire. And again, Eliyahu is, God must be in the fire. Text says, God was not in the fire. Now, before we go to the next thing, this is reminiscent of two things, and they're connected. For those who come to the Tuesday class, when we did Maaseh Merkavah, you'll remember that right at the beginning, second verse already of Ezekiel, the vision of the Merkavah, that first there was a storm wind, and then there was, let me just get it right, just 1 second. Just 1 second. So first, there was a storm wind, just like with Eliyahu. And then there was a great cloud. So here, instead of the great cloud, there was what we'll call an earthquake. And then the third thing also was the fire. So here we see that there's a connection. And for those who learned about Maaseh Merkavah, we learned this story, the story that we're going over right now, because it was in the context of Eliyahu was having an experience of the Merkavah. And if you remember, out of the fire came the noga, the surrounding glow, and from the glow came the chashmal, that mysterious word that means silence and speaking. Chashmal is very, very special energy that is only mentioned 3 times in the entire Tanakh, all in the vision of Ezekiel. But also, this is very similar to what happened at Mount Sinai. Here, Eliyahu is at Mount Sinai. He's in or right outside the cave that Moshe was in. And we learned that the experience at Sinai was a mass experience of Maaseh Merkavah. The entire people experienced it. And there also, we learn that there was dark clouds. The earth was shaking. There was a fire. So here we see 3 different incidences that are all being woven together in a certain way. Eliyahu is experiencing what Ezekiel experienced, and Ezekiel is experiencing what the whole people experienced at Mount Sinai, which is the very place that Eliyahu is standing right now. So here we see Maaseh Merkavah spread out over the generations. Now, after the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, so then Eliyahu, this is one of the most important verses in the book of Kings, he hears a kol demama daka, a small, thin, silent voice. And when he heard it, he knew that God was in this voice. And he goes out, and we'll pick up this, but I want to discuss this more, is the kol demama daka. This is the chashmal. It's exactly what it is. It's a silent speaking voice. The paradox of how can you have speaking if it's silent? But this is, as we said many times, this is the sounds of silence. And everyone knows the song from Simon and Garfunkel. But this is what they're drawing on. They didn't just like make this up. This is one of the most famous stories in the Bible, in the Tanakh. And Eliyahu hears this here. It's almost impossible to even translate it. A small, thin, silent voice. Demama means silent, but it's also speaking. So there's a beautiful statement in the Tikkunei Zohar that connects kol demama daka with the Amidah, with the cardinal prayer of Judaism. It's called the Amidah, which means literally the standing prayer. Nonetheless, many people refer to it as the silent prayer, because according to Jewish law, we are supposed to not only move our lips, but we're supposed to enunciate the words so that our ears can just barely hear it, but no one else can hear it. And so it's an approximate of a silent voice. And so the Tikkunei Zohar makes a beautiful connection between this silent voice and the voice of prayer. Someone once asked Rabbi Nachman, how loud should we say our prayers? And Rabbi Nachman said, you should say your prayers so loud that no one hears it. Now, you should know that there are different streams or philosophies of prayer. There are certain types of prayer that go out of their way not to what's called shakel, like when you daven, just still, no arm movements, no, just still. And then you have, let's say, the Karliner Hasidim, that they scream their davening from the beginning to the end. Not the Amidah, but Psuki de Zimra, the Shema, all of their prayers, they're yelling in a loud voice. So you have both almost extremes within Jewish tradition. But the Tikkunei Zohar specifically addresses the idea of the Amidah being almost like the chashmal, silence and speaking at the same time. So when Eliyahu hears the silent speaking voice, so then it says that he wrapped himself in his mantle and he went out to converse with God. And interestingly, what happens? God repeats the same question. Eliyahu, what are you doing here? So you would think like, we went through that already. Eliyahu gave his speech already. why he's there. And yet God asks the same question again, and he answers in the same way. He answers in the same way. I'm the last of the prophets. The people have abrogated your covenant. They have killed all of the prophets. They've broken down all the altars. And then, so God speaks to him and tells him three things. He says, return now and go to Damascus and anoint Hazael to be king of Aram. Aram is a neighboring country. Go and anoint this person to be king of Aram. Then go and anoint Jehu to be king of the northern kingdom. And you should go and find this person called Elisha, and he will become a prophet in your place. So this is very significant because what is going on here? What does it mean he'll be a prophet in your place? So according to tradition, Eliyahu was a zealot. We've discussed this a little bit already, that when he, in a certain way, took the key of rain away from God, God held the key of rain. And Eliyahu, without asking, he meant it for God's glory. He meant to defend God. He meant to try to end the idol worship of the northern kingdom. He meant absolutely well. But he said, there will be no rain unless I say so. So this we learned already. I'm not going to go back over it. But he was a zealot. And we learned that the souls of Nadav and Avihu and Pinchas were part of the soul of Eliyahu. Remember, it says in the Gemara, Pinchas, hu Eliyahu. Everyone asks, how can that be? There's hundreds of years between Pinchas and Eliyahu Navi. How could he be the same person? And one of the answers is this is one of the many, many, many places where reincarnation is alluded to in the text. Not explicitly, but alluded to, that the soul of Pinchas entered into the soul of Eliyahu. Pinchas, hu Eliyahu. And Pinchas also, his claim to fame, not that he meant it that way, but his act was an act of zealousness when he killed Zimri and Cosby to save the Jewish people. They were being wiped out by a plague because of their evil behavior. And Pinchas, by killing them, stopped the plague. And God rewarded him with a covenant of peace. But here Eliyahu is saying the people have abrogated your covenant. So this is something that not everyone knows. I think everyone knows that at a circumcision, we always have a chair for Eliyahu. Eliyahu comes to every circumcision. In some shuls, they have a very elaborate chair that is only used at circumcisions. If you don't have an elaborate chair, you still designate a chair. And before the circumcision, you actually place the child on the chair of Eliyahu. So in one sense, this is like Eliyahu coming to every Pesach Seder. So he would think that this is a great merit that Eliyahu deserved or merited to. But actually, because of this story, the Midrash says, why does Eliyahu come to every circumcision? Why does he come to every Pesach Seder? Because Eliyahu said they have broken their covenant with you. The Jewish people have abrogated the covenant. It's like over. And God in the Midrash says that, yes, they've been worshiping idols, but there's a remnant. And from my side, the covenant will never be broken. But Eliyahu, you're saying that the covenant is broken? You need to go to every circumcision so that you know that the covenant has not been broken. And we could say the same thing. It's not said in the same way, but it's very similar why Eliyahu comes to the Pesach Seder. Because if we broke the covenant, then in a certain way, that's the end of the Jewish people. But no, every year, even with all of the Jewish people's mistakes and failings and shortcomings, we're still doing Pesach Seder. So Eliyahu comes to every single one. God is showing him, you said that they broke the covenant. It's over. No, it's not over. And that comes from this story. But also, we see very clearly that God says to Eliyahu, go and find Elisha, and he will become a prophet in your place. Which means, Eliyahu, you've done your work in the world. Eliyahu kind of picked up on this when he asked God. He said, take my life. I've done what I can. And here, in a certain way, Eliyahu doesn't pass away here. He's still around for a number of chapters. By the way, we are very close to the end of the first book of Kings. And Eliyahu is also in the second book of Kings. But Elisha does take over for him. And so here we see a turning point in Eliyahu's life. And really in the book of Kings, a great transition is happening because Eliyahu is a major figure here in the book of Kings. But in a certain way, his zealousness had caught up with him. He had done what he could in this world, and God was saying, it's time to move on. Now, there's a question that I had that I didn't really find a real answer to. But what's interesting is we always have to have a juxtaposition. Right before this story, if you remember, that was the whole contest of the gods. And when Eliyahu brought fire down from the heavens, what did the people, how did they respond? Hashem, Hua Elokim. Hashem, Hua Elokim. They were expressing that now we see that God is God. And yet, the next story is Eliyahu is claiming that the people have broken down your altars. And remember, they built an altar in order to bring this sacrifice. And so it's a bit mysterious or paradoxical. Now, it's true that Jezebel says to Eliyahu, you're going to be dead tomorrow. You're finished. And he runs away. So yes, we can understand, but it's right after the incident where it seems at least that he proved to the people who the real God is. And yet here he's claiming they've broken down your altars and they've broken your covenant. So there's some gray area here that I haven't found, at least yet, a sufficient understanding of what was going through Eliyahu's mind, that this last event, which was so dramatic, he brought God's fire down And remember, they poured all this water over the altar, over the sacrifice. It was a miraculous event. And yet, shortly after, Eliyahu is saying, the people have broken the covenant. So that's a little bit why God is saying, like you're missing something, Eliyahu. In your zealousness, you're missing something. They are redeemable. There is hope. So at the end of chapter 19, so Eliyahu leaves there. This is part of the 40 days and 40 nights. He now is leaving Mount Sinai. And so here it says, on the way, he finds Elisha. Elisha is plowing his field. And he says to Elisha, Eliyahu is very, very famous. So when Elisha sees him, now here also, it doesn't necessarily mean that Elisha has never met Eliyahu before. There is a good reason to believe that he is one of the students in these schools of prophecy. He's not like just someone who's plowing his field and God says, go find this guy and he's going to be a prophet instead of you. There seems to have been some connection. So he comes and he says to him, when he came, Eliyahu take the same mantle that he was wearing at Mount Sinai, he takes and he puts it on Elisha. So this is a very symbolic act. And he says to him, and he understood what was going on. In other words, this was a symbolic act. And he understood that Eliyahu was saying, it's time for you to come with me. So Elisha says, he asked permission, can I go and kiss my mother and father before I leave? And Eliyahu gives him permission. He goes, he comes back, and he makes a feast. In other words, when he was plowing, he wasn't plowing by himself. There was a whole group of, we'll call it his contemporaries, that were plowing. And he slaughtered his oxen and he made a big feast. Why? Eliyahu has called him to come with him. Like this is like what greater thing could it be? That's why we can understand that he had some kind of connection with Eliyahu, but it wasn't that you're going to be in place of me. But when he put his mantle on him, so this was like symbolic, and here Elisha is joyous. And so he makes this whole feast, and he goes with Eliyahu. And that's the end of chapter 19. Chapter 20, we're going to do relatively quickly. For those who have been coming, a few weeks ago, I said that those chapters or those incidences or events in the book of Kings, some of them we will go into very deeply, and others we're going to go quicker through. So chapter 20, the whole thing tells one story really, and I'll do my best to tell it fairly quickly. It's a fairly long story, but the king of Aram at that time was Ben-Hadad. Aram and Israel fighting all of the time, just like Israel and the Philistines. Aram is up north, and constant battles. So, and the borders would change. So Ben-Hadad sends a message to Achav. Remember, Achav is this evil king that Eliyahu is in relationship with, saying, I'm not going to attack you. I'm just going to take everything of yours. I'm going to take your wives. I'm going to take your riches. I'm going to take your children. And that's it. You're finished. And Achav was terrified of him. And he, in a certain way, agreed to it. Okay, just let's not have war. You need to take everything of mine. Go ahead. And Ben-Hadad responds that I'm sending messengers and I am going to take everything of yours. And then Achav goes to his wise men and says, like, what do I do here? What do I do here? And they said, you can't allow this. You can't allow him just to come and kind of like usurp the kingship from you. And so what happens is there's now a war. But the people are supporting Achav. And even the text says Ben-Hadad was a drunkard. And he's going to run this war against the northern kingdom. And it says that he was drinking himself into a stupor as he's leading his troops into battle. And Achav is victorious. And a prophet comes to him and in the name of God is like defending Achav and instructing him how to fight this battle. So the first battle, Achav totally defeats Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad escapes. And he and his wise people say they fought in, one second. They fought in the hills. Remember, this is up north, the Galil. And so Ben-Hadad and the wise people said, well, their God is a God of the hills. We'll fight them in the valleys. Now, I mean, how stupid can you be? And so he comes back with his whole army, and he's now going to fight them in the valleys. And again, the prophet comes to Achav and instructs him how to be victorious. And again, he's victorious. And the entire army of Aram is wiped out. But Ben-Hadad is still alive. And he has a few people with him. And so they think, let's appeal to the king's compassion. He's a king. I'm a king. Okay, he defeated me. This is very similar, if you remember the story of Shaul, who defeats Amalek, but leaves Agag, the king, alive. For that, he lost his kingship. So Ben-Hadad comes and he begs for compassion. He says, any cities that we took from you, I'll give back to you. I won't bother you anymore. We'll make a covenant between us. There'll be no more wars. And Achav agrees to it. And he allows Ben-Hadad to go back to Aram. So what happens here is it's not an easy story to understand. One of the prophets, remember, there were still 100 prophets that were being hidden And one of these prophets comes to another of the prophets and says, God commands you to strike me in the face. Why? What he wanted to do is he wanted to come, this prophet wanted to come as if he was injured in the war. And he wants to appear to the king. And in a certain way, through a mashal, an allegory, try to like tell him, why did you let the king of who just made war with us go? Why did you do that? But he wanted to pretend that he was one of the injured soldiers. So he says to this other prophet, the God is saying, strike me. And this other prophet refused to. Either because he questioned, what kind of prophecy is this? That I'm supposed to strike him? As he didn't believe him that this was really from God. And so what happens next is we had an incident like this 2 or 3 weeks ago. Also, really no answers for. So the prophet says, because you did not listen to the word of God, when you leave me right now, a lion is going to attack you and kill you. And that's exactly what happened. And if you remember, we had a similar incident to a prophet who he was naive. He didn't do anything purposely, but he didn't do what God had told him to do, but not out of malice, not with premeditation. But here also, and that's what happened. This person who didn't strike the other prophet was eaten by a lion. And if in the other story, what basically said that there's certain things that we just don't understand why God operates in the way that he operates. We have no idea who this person was in a previous lifetime. We have no idea what he might have done in this lifetime. Anyways, the prophet now goes to another person, but not another prophet, and says, please strike me. And this person, who was just a regular person, understood that there was some reason that this person wanted to be struck, and he struck him. And so he injured him. And now he could go to Achav and pretend that he's an injured soldier. And that's what he did. And he gave him a parable. And basically, it was a parable to try to show to Achav, you did wrong by letting the king go. Now, this is an example of what the sages said, a very important example. And this is where Shaul failed also. And the saying of the sages is, one who is compassionate on the cruel will in the end be cruel to those they should be compassionate to. It's a very, very important and well-known statement. I'll say it again, that those who show compassion to those who are cruel, in the end will be cruel to those that they should be compassionate to. And so this prophet says to Achav, since you let this cruel person go, God is going to make an exchange, your life for his life. And here is where we'll see that there's 2 places God now has run out of patience with Achav. And so here I just want to interject, because we've been dealing with this king, Achav, and his wife, Jezebel, for a number of chapters, a number of weeks. And the text says specifically that he did more evil than any of the other evil kings before him. And Isabel was considered the worst of the worst. She brought the worship of the Baal into Israel. She was the one who brought all these priests of Baal and made temples to the Baal and spread idol worship all over the land. And in a certain sense, Eliyahu was correct. They killed off the prophets and they introduced idol worship. And Achav, he went along with everything. And so there is, again, these are what I call cheshbonot. These are accountings that only God understands. Why is Achav still around? In other words, God seemed to have tremendous patience for him. But here, in the name of the prophet, it kind of like the gig is up. That God has lost patience with Achav. And then I'm going to do chapter 21, and a very, very important story. So what happens is so the prophet says in God's name, very simply, your life for Ben-Hadad's life. But he didn't go into like detail. But Achav understood that his days were numbered. So you would think maybe he would do tshuva. No, that's why the next story comes, is that next door, I will say, or near Achav's palace, there was a man called Navot who had a vineyard. And the king comes to Navot and says, I would like to buy your vineyard for you because I want to make a vegetable garden. And this person, Navot, said, I can't sell you this land. It's an inheritance from my fathers. This has been in our family. So you're the king and you want a vegetable garden, but I can't be here. I can't sell it. So interestingly enough, Achav was such an evil king. He had no problem killing off all the prophets. You would think he would just kill him on the spot, but he doesn't. He goes back home and he's brooding and he's depressed and he won't eat and he's just laying in bed. And Jezebel comes to him and says, what's wrong with you? So he tells her the story. And she says, don't worry, I'll get you his vineyard. Don't worry about a thing. Go and eat. I'll take care of it. She goes, and in short, she gets a number of people who are now going to spread a rumor that Navot is worshiping idols and is doing wrong things. It was all lies, and the people that she got knew that they were lies, and they had a whole court session. He's found guilty and he's killed. And she goes back to her husband and says, it's all taken care of. Go take the vineyard. Achav doesn't object. He goes and takes the vineyard. And then God sends Eliyahu. We haven't heard of Eliyahu, the whole war and this whole thing. God sends Eliyahu with a message to Achav, basically saying that you've gone too far now. You have gone too far. You will basically die like a dog in the street, and they'll lick up your blood, And the same thing with your wife. Like, as we said already, it was as it were predicted that God had lost his patience with Achav. Again, the question is, in a certain way, why God had as much patience as he had up to that point. The only thing that I could really understand is that Achav had a big neshama, had tremendous potential, and God was trying to wait to see if he would change his ways. And apparently he had a big neshama. If you remember, we learned that the northern kingdom under Achav was very wealthy, well established. He had a power, but unfortunately it was manifest in tremendous evil. But Eliyahu comes with a message very graphic and saying, and not only you, your whole lineage is going to be wiped out. And so what happens here is, interestingly enough, and it's a long speech that Eliyahu makes to Achav in the name of God. And when it says, when Achav heard these words, that he tore his clothing, he put on sackcloth, he fasted, and it says he went softly. So here we understand that obviously, whether he was doing this out of love of God or just fear of the punishment that was about to overcome him, it appears that he's trying to do tshuva at this point, very, very late in the story. So God comes to Eliyahu and says, do you see how Achav is humbling himself? Do you see how in other words, do you see how he's doing tshuva? He says, because of this, I will not bring all of this evil upon him in his days. And in other words, I will put off this judgment. It will happen, but I will delay it, because it appears that he is doing tshuva. He says, in his days I will not do it, but in his son's days, all of the Midah keneged Midah, measure for measure, will come back on his sons and grandchildren, and they will be basically wiped out. And that's how chapter 21 ends. So here I just want to mention that in a certain way, this story is very, very similar to the story of after David has taken Bathsheba, she's pregnant, he tries to hide it by sending her husband or her ex-husband, because they were technically divorced at the time. He sent Uriah to his death in battle. And then the prophet Natan comes to him and says a parable. And the parable is, there was a rich man and a poor man. And the rich man had tremendous possessions, and he had guests, and he wanted to serve them. And there was a poor man who had one lamb. That's all he had. And the rich man because he probably lived on his lamb, but he seized the poor man's lamb and he slaughtered it and he served it for his feast. So Nathan says this to David, and David is outraged. He's outraged. How could he do such a thing? And then Nathan turns to him and says, you are the rich man. You took Bathsheba in a way that you shouldn't have done it. And David does tshuva on the spot. He does tshuva on the spot, and God accepts his tshuva, but he still has to pay the price for what he did. And that's why he had so many troubles in his own house. God said that because you did this, evil will come from your own house. And that's why he had the rebellion of Avshalom, came from his own son. And a second son rebelled against him. Yet, God accepted his tshuva. Here, it's a similar type of story. Here he's the king, and he wants his vineyard. And the king is fabulously wealthy. And this person has this inheritance from his fathers, this Aram, this vineyard. And in a certain way, but here, Jezebel goes and kills him. And then God comes and tells Eliyahu, go tell him that this is it. You're done with. And yet it appears that he also does tshuva. And God says, okay, I will not bring this evil upon him right now, but in his son's time, I will bring that evil. So I'm not saying it's an exact parallel. It's not really an exact parallel, but it's very close. It's very, very close here that both David and Achav were kings. They both suffered the consequences of what they did. But the difference is, it's clear that David's type of tshuva was authentic, was real. And we know that for the rest of his life, he did tshuva for this one act. Here, it appears that Achav is doing tshuva, but here, God doesn't say, do you see how he's doing tshuva? It says, do you see how he's humbling himself? In other words, God obviously knows the difference between sincere tshuva and a type of tshuva that is maybe partial, but is not the same kind of tshuva that David HaMelech did. And just as a preview, we have only one more chapter, which we will take up next week, and we finish the first book of Kings. So next week, we will probably begin the second book of Kings. So at this point, for those who came on late, I feel obligated to use this opportunity to remind everyone that we are in the closing days of 2025, and Or Chadash is in its closing days of its once-a-year fundraiser. Again, I want to thank all those who responded so generously. It makes all the difference in the world for us. And all those who have not responded yet, who have benefited from what Or Chadash does, from our books, our music, our classes, our home hospitality, our events that we've run in 50 cities around the world. If you've benefited from those, please help us continue our work.